The field hospital at Vera Station smelled like copper and antiseptic and something else. Something biological and wrong, that Corporal Morose had stopped trying to name after the first week. She had learned, in the 14 months since the cease protocols were signed, to stop naming things that had no good name. The war had lasted 6 years. The silence it left behind lasted longer in ways that couldn't be measured by a calendar. She was cataloging medical supplies in Storage Bay 9 when she heard the prisoner transport arrive. She heard it before she saw it, the low mechanical complaint of the crawler's suspension, followed by the particular kind of quiet that descends when armed personnel try to be very careful. She set down her inventory tablet and moved to the bay's narrow window. There were 3 of them. She had seen Veth before at a distance, through the telescopic sights of a forward scout's imaging system. She had never seen one up close. They were taller than the intelligence briefings had suggested, roughly 2.1 meters, and their secondary limb structure, the articulated pair that folded against the torso when not in use, gave them a silhouette that looked, from certain angles, almost avian. Their skin was a deep, mottled gray-green, photoreceptive in ways human skin was not, capable of subtle chromatic shifts that their species used for communication the way humans used facial expressions. She knew this from the briefings. Knowing it academically was different from watching it happen in real life. The one in the middle, clearly the most injured, was cycling through colors that the briefing documents had cross-referenced as distress indicators. Pale silver along the jaw ridges. Muted ochre at the temples. It was doing this unconsciously, the way a human might wince or tremble. The 2 flanking it were trying to hold it upright, and they were struggling because one of them was also injured, and the whole arrangement looked precarious in the way that things look precarious right before they collapse. The escort detail, 4 soldiers from the 34th, people Mara knew by face if not by name, were maintaining a perimeter that was clearly more about their own discomfort than about genuine security risk. The Veth were not armed. They were barely standing. One of them looked at Mara through the window and she looked back, and for a long moment neither of them moved. The Veth's eyes were amber and vertically pupilled, and they were doing something she hadn't expected. They were afraid. Not aggressive. Not calculating. Afraid, in the same basic animal way that anything afraid is afraid, with the chest tight and the body trying to decide between fight and flight while knowing both options are unavailable. She went back to her inventory. She had no reason to be in the intake bay. She had every reason to stay in Storage Bay 9 and finish her count and hand the tablet to Lieutenant Ferris and go eat whatever was being served that evening and sleep for the 6 hours the rotation allowed. She had done this every day for 4 months at Vera Station. It was a routine that worked. Routines that worked were precious things in a post-war posting. She picked up her tablet. She set it down again. She looked at the window. The injured Veth had gone down to one knee. The 2 others were trying to help it rise, and the escort detail was watching and not helping, which was protocol. No physical contact with prisoners without medical authorization, and she was medical and she was standing right here. She grabbed her kit from the hook by the door. She told herself it was purely professional. A medical practitioner did not let a prisoner deteriorate from a treatable condition simply because the prisoner belonged to a species that had, until 14 months ago, been actively trying to kill her. That was what she told herself. She believed approximately 60% of it. She pushed through the bay door into the cold Vera evening and crossed the compound to the intake area and said, in her most professionally neutral voice, to the escort sergeant, "I'm authorizing medical contact. Stand by." The sergeant looked at her like she had suggested something mildly insane. Then he looked at the Veth on its knee. Then he nodded. Mara crouched in front of the injured Veth. Up close, the chromatic distress signals were intense, fast-cycling silvers and ochres that the briefings had rated as extreme pain response. She opened her kit. She didn't speak. There was no translation protocol yet in place at Vera Station. That infrastructure was still being debated by people who had never had to kneel in the mud with someone who was hurting. She worked. She stabilized the injury site, a deep laceration along the lower torso, poorly dressed, clearly old. She did not think about what had caused it or which side had caused it. She thought about tissue and pressure, and the basic geometry of closing a wound. When she was done, she sat back on her heels. The Veth looked at her. Its chromatic signals had slowed. The silver along its jaw ridges had deepened slightly, a frequency she didn't have a briefing reference for. It raised one of its primary hands and held it, palm forward, in a gesture that the briefings had not covered because the briefings were written by people who had mostly been trying to figure out how to kill Veth rather than how to talk to them. She raised her own hand. Palm forward. Mirroring it. Something shifted in the compound. She couldn't name it. She had learned to stop naming things that had no good name. But it was there, real as the mud under her knees and the cold in the air and the weight of the 6 years that had preceded this moment. Something had shifted, and it was small, and it was not nothing. His name, rendered in the closest approximation that the Veristation linguistic team could produce, was something like thresh. The Veth phonemic corresponded to a subvocal in its lower register and required a resonating chamber humans didn't have, so the team had simply picked the syllable that caused the least distortion. He didn't correct them when they used it. He sat in the medical observation room with the stillness of something that had learned, very recently, that stillness was safer than movement. Mara was not assigned to the observation room. She was assigned to Storage Bay 9 and to the rotation schedule that Lieutenant Ferris managed with the particular obsessive precision of a man who found comfort in logistics. But the observation room was on the way to the mess hall, and it had a window, and she had started taking slightly longer routes to meals than was strictly necessary. She told herself she was monitoring a medical case. This was true in the technical sense. Thresh's wound had been serious enough that follow-up observation was genuinely warranted. She told herself the follow-up didn't have to be performed by her specifically. This was also true. On the third day she went inside. The observation room had a table and 2 chairs on the human side of the transparent partition and a cot and a water dispenser on the Veth side. Thresh was sitting on the edge of the cot when she came in, and he turned to look at her with those amber eyes, and the chromatic signals along his jaw were doing something she'd begun to catalog on the notepad she kept in her breast pocket. She had started a private reference guide, cross-checking what she observed against what she felt, inductively mapping the signals the way you might map a coastline you'd never seen before, imprecisely but with attention. Today's signal was new. A slow amber gold, steady rather than cycling. She wrote it down. She set a water container on the tray slot and pushed it through. He looked at it. He looked at her. He picked it up and drank from it, and she noticed, not for the first time, that Veth drinking was nearly silent in a way that felt almost deliberate, like a practiced restraint. She sat down in the chair facing the partition. She had brought a report she was supposed to be reading, resupply manifests for the upcoming quarterly audit, and she opened it because having a reason to sit somewhere made sitting there easier to explain to herself. She read. He watched. After about 10 minutes he reached under his cot and retrieved something she hadn't known he had. A small flat stone, unworked, that he'd apparently carried through intake, through search, through processing. The kind of thing that escapes notice because it looks like nothing. He held it in his primary hand and began to run his secondary hand across it. Not shaping it. Just touching it. She recognized the behavior, not from the briefings but from humans, from soldiers and nurses and support staff who touched things repeatedly in the particular way that meant the touching was doing something for them internally. Worry stones. Grounding objects. The rock was not decoration. It was medicine of a different kind. She reached into her pocket and put her notepad on the table. She put her pen beside it. She didn't do anything with them. She just put them there. After a moment he put the stone on his side of the partition. He didn't push it through. He just put it where she could see it. She looked at it. She looked at him. She wrote something in her notepad, the date, the time, a description of the stone, a question mark. Documentation, she told herself. Medical observation. The notation would look entirely reasonable to anyone who reviewed her files, which helped, because it allowed her to be honest with herself about the part that wasn't about documentation at all. The part that wasn't about documentation was this: she was curious. Not curious the way you were curious about something in a briefing. Curious the way you were curious about a person. That was the thing she hadn't expected and couldn't unnotice and was finding increasingly difficult to reconcile with 14 months of post-war official policy and 6 years of everything before that. The linguistic team made their first working translation breakthrough on day 4. It was limited, approximately 40 functional concepts, mostly logistical, nothing that could carry emotional nuance. She heard about it in the mess hall. She nodded and ate her food and said nothing, because she had already been communicating with Thresh for 3 days without any of those 40 concepts, and she wasn't entirely sure the breakthrough was going to help as much as the team thought it would. Language was one kind of communication. It wasn't the only kind. She had known this in theory. She was learning it in practice, which was different and considerably more disorienting. On day 5 she brought 2 paper cups of the station's terrible coffee substitute. One for herself, one for the tray slot, not knowing whether Veth metabolisms could process it, having checked as much of the medical literature as existed, very little, and most of it from autopsy rather than from living subjects, which told its own grim story about the origins of human Veth medical knowledge. She put the cup in the tray slot and made a gesture she hoped communicated optional. He looked at the cup for a long time. He picked it up. He smelled it, His olfactory ridge along the upper lip flared slightly. He looked at her. The slow amber gold signal she'd catalogued on day 3 appeared again. She drank from her own cup. He raised his and made a small, careful motion that her body, without her brain's conscious involvement, recognized immediately as a toast. The same gesture, reduced to its physical minimum, that humans made when they wanted to acknowledge a shared moment across a table. She raised her cup back. Her hand was not entirely steady. She was fairly sure his wasn't either, though it was harder to tell with a Veth, and she had no reference point, and that was the honest truth of where they were. Two people with no reference points, building one from scratch, in a room that smelled like antiseptic in the wreckage of a war that neither of them had started. She wrote in her notepad, amber gold sustained signal, possible designation, recognition. She underlined it. She sat with it for a while. The report was filed by Sergeant Delacourt on day 11. Mara read it at 0630 on day 12, sitting in Lieutenant Ferris's office, with the particular experience of reading something about yourself that someone else has written as if you weren't there and could not be considered a reliable narrator of your own behavior. The report did not allege misconduct. It flagged what it called irregular contact patterns with prisoner designate Veth 03, referring to Thresh by the intake code rather than the name the linguistic team had settled on, which was itself a kind of statement. It noted the frequency of her visits, daily she hadn't hidden it, and the duration and the non-standard material exchanges, which was how it described the coffee and the water and the 2 military-issue nutrition bars she'd passed through the tray slot when she noticed that the standard prisoner rations appeared to be causing digestive distress in ways she'd documented medically and reported through proper channels, which had not, in the intervening week, produced any adjustment to the ration schedule. Lieutenant Ferris was a careful man. He read the report twice before he looked at her. He was not unkind, she knew that about him. He was also not inclined toward decisions that could complicate his quarterly reviews. "You understand how this looks," he said. "I understand how Sergeant Delacourt thinks it looks," she said. "That's not the same as telling me how it actually is." She considered her answer carefully. Outside Ferris's window, the Vera Plateau spread in its brown and gray expanse, beautiful in a bleak and demanding way that she'd come to find almost comforting, the way you found comfort in things that asked nothing of you. "It's medical follow-up on a prisoner with a significant wound history," she said. "It's also more than that. I'm aware it's more than that." Ferris set the report down. "More than that in what direction?" "In the direction of, I think we have an opportunity here that we're not using. The linguistic team has 40 working concepts. Veth 03" she caught herself, Thresh. "He's coherent, he's stable, he's clearly intelligent, and he's been in that room for 11 days with nothing to do and no one to talk to except through a partition. If we're trying to establish communication infrastructure for the post-conflict framework, we're wasting a resource. You think he'd cooperate with expanded linguistic work? I think he already is cooperating. With me. Without a protocol. And I think that's worth something." Ferris was quiet for a moment. She watched him think through the political geometry of it, the risk of backing something irregular against the possible value of something that worked. She had done the same calculation herself repeatedly in the past 11 days. She wasn't sure her version and his version came out at the same place. "The Veth prisoners are being processed for repatriation under the cease protocols," he said finally. "The other 2 are scheduled for transfer in 6 days. Veth 03's medical hold extends that. You're not creating a situation where—" "No," she said more sharply than she intended. "I'm not using a medical hold to keep him here. The wound is genuinely not healed. If it were, I'd clear him." He nodded slowly. "I'll note that this conversation happened," he said. "I won't forward Delacourt's report to command. Not yet. But Mara," he used her given name, which he almost never did, which meant he was about to say something he considered important. "Be careful about what you're building there. It's easy to forget that we don't know yet what they're building on their side." She had thought about this. She had thought about it the way you thought about things that had no good answer, circling them, looking at them from different angles, not finding a resolution but finding, at least, a clearer view of the problem. She didn't know what Thresh made of their interactions. She didn't know his personal history, his losses, his reasons for being part of the conflict. She knew his wound pattern and his chromatic signals and the way he held his stone and the way he'd raised a paper cup of terrible coffee substitute as if it meant something. That was a partial picture. She was aware it was partial. But she also thought about the amber gold signal she'd catalogued on day 3 and continued to observe consistently when she entered the room, and she thought about the way he'd angled his cot at some point in the last 4 days, so that it faced the partition rather than the wall. A small thing, a rearrangement that required effort and produced no functional benefit except proximity to a window she sat beside. She thought about small things that were not nothing. "I know," she said to Ferris. "I know I don't have the whole picture." She went back to her work. She went back to the observation room that evening. She brought a second cup. She didn't know if she was doing the right thing. She knew she wasn't doing nothing, which felt, in the wreckage of a war that had been made of people doing nothing or doing worse than nothing for 6 years, like something worth continuing. Thresh was sitting on his cot when she arrived. The amber gold was already visible before she'd sat down. She noted it. She wrote the time. She pushed the cup through the tray slot. He caught it before it reached the other side. Faster than she expected. Like he'd been watching for it. He linguistic team's working vocabulary reached 112 concepts by the end of the 3rd week. Dr. Yusra Hamad, who led the team, was a small, precise woman with a background in xenolinguistics that had been almost entirely theoretical before the war created a brutal demand for practical application. She came to observe on day 22, sitting beside Mara at the partition with a recording device and a tablet full of notation, and she watched the two of them with the focused attention of someone watching a natural phenomenon that has so far defied modeling. "You're code switching," she said afterward in the corridor, while Thresh's meal was being delivered by the rotation staff. "I don't know what that means in this context," Mara said. "It means you've built a mixed communication system. Part vocabulary, part gesture, part chromatic response, part object exchange. It's not any one language. It's a pidgin. A contact language. The first contact language between humans and Veth, assembled by a medical corporal and a prisoner in 3 weeks." Hamad looked at her with an expression that was equal parts scientific interest and something more complicated. "You understand that what you've done here is significant." "I understand that he's a person and I treated him like one," Mara said. "I'm not sure that required much intelligence on my part. It required more than you're giving yourself credit for. It also required something on his part." Hamad glanced back at the observation room. "He's doing it too, you know. Adapting. The chromatic range he's using with you is more controlled than what we observed in the first week. He's learned to flag the signals he wants you to see. That's not instinct. That's deliberate communication." Mara had noticed this, but hearing it described by a professional made it feel more solid. More real in the way that named things felt more real than unnamed ones. "What does it mean?" she asked. "Pragmatically. It means he trusts you enough to try. Which is, given what he's been through, given where he is, given the history between our species, not a small thing." Hamad closed her tablet. "I want to formalize this. Create a structured contact protocol based on what you've developed. With your cooperation and his if he consents." The consent question was harder than it sounded. Translating the concept of voluntary consent to an expanded research program, as distinct from the coerced compliance that prisoners were often pressured into in ways that the CEASE protocols technically prohibited and practically did not always prevent, required 40 minutes of careful work with Hamad's vocabulary set, Mara's gestural shorthand, and a level of patience from Thresh that she noted with something that wasn't quite guilt but was adjacent to it, because she was aware that she was asking him to do more cognitive labor than anyone in his position should be required to do. He consented. He was clear about it. The signal was one Mara had catalogued in week 1 as affirmative, and it was accompanied by a deliberate gesture he'd developed for situations where clarity was important. A secondary hand extended forward, palm up, which she had come to read as "Here, take this, I am giving it willingly." It was a thing she had told Hamad about and which Hamad had noted with quiet intensity in her records. The structured sessions began. They were 3 times weekly, with Hamad present and recording and occasionally directing, but Mara there throughout because Thresh's chromatic ranges and behavioral patterns stabilized significantly when she was in the room, and Hamad was scientist enough to prioritize good data over procedural neatness. In week 4 they reached the grief vocabulary. This was Hamad's term for it, the cluster of concepts that described loss, absence, the weight of the dead. The Veth had 47 distinct chromatic designations for states of grief. Humans had a handful of words and a great deal of silence. Mara learned this on a Tuesday. She sat with it for the rest of the session and said very little, and Thresh, who had become attentive to her silences in ways that she found both unnerving and oddly moving, shifted his chromatic signal to something she hadn't seen before. A deep, slow blue-gray at the jaw ridges. Very still. Not cycling. She looked it up later in Hamad's reference guide. It wasn't there yet, the guide was incomplete. She wrote it in her notepad instead with the date and the context, and the best description she could manage. Asterisk something like keeping company with a person who is sad. Being present for it. Not trying to fix it. Asterisk. She didn't know if she was right. She knew it was the most meaningful thing she'd seen in 4 weeks, and she sat with that knowledge in her bunk that night, looking at the corrugated ceiling of the dormitory module, listening to the Vera wind move across the plateau outside. She had grown up with a mother who said that the most important thing you could do for a grieving person was stay. Just stay. Not talk, not fix, just stay. She thought about 47 words for grief. She thought about what it meant that a species had 47 words for it. She thought about a 6-year war and all the occasions 47 words would have been necessary. She turned off her light. She stayed. The repatriation order arrived on day 38. It was not unexpected. The medical hold had been extended twice, once genuinely, once with a marginally more generous interpretation of fully healed than Mara would have applied to a human patient, and she had known each time she countersigned the extension that she was borrowing time with no clear plan for what to do with it. She told Thresh on day 39. She had Hamad with her for the vocabulary and she used it carefully, the formal concepts for time and departure and the bureaucratic structures that determined where people went. She was precise. She did not want him to misunderstand what was happening or why. He was not being expelled punitively. He was being returned to his people under the terms of an agreement that was supposed to be the foundation of something better. She said all of this as clearly as she could. His chromatic response was something she hadn't seen before and couldn't fully interpret. It started with a muted silver, the distress frequency, the one she'd first seen in the compound on the night he arrived, and then it shifted through several signals quickly, too fast for her to catalog in real time, and then it settled into something that was deep and still and very dark at the jaw ridges, with a very faint amber gold threading through it. She wrote it down later from memory, doing her best to reproduce the sequence. She sent it to Hamad. Hamad replied that evening. Asterisk I think it's grief and recognition combined. The grief vocabulary tends toward darker signals. The amber gold is the one you've noted as recognition. He may be experiencing them simultaneously. I don't have a reference for the combination. It might be specific to this situation. Asterisk. Mara put her tablet down and sat in the very specific kind of quiet that she recognized as the quiet inside something that you've been trying not to look at directly. She had spent 39 days telling herself a series of things that were technically true but were not, in the aggregate, honest. She was doing medical follow-up. She was contributing to linguistic research. She was acting on professional instinct. All true. Also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had looked through a window at someone who was afraid, and she had not been able to walk away, and she had found in the 39 days since, someone who had lost as much as she had in a war that neither of them had made, and who had sat across a partition and shared something anyway. Something without a good name. Something that was not nothing. She went to the observation room that night, outside her normal visit hours. The overnight staff let her through without comment, which told her that her irregular contact patterns had been widely noted and collectively decided to be someone else's problem. She sat down in her chair. He was already awake, which might have meant he hadn't slept, or might have meant he had different sleep architecture than she did. She didn't know. There were so many things she didn't know. She put both hands on the table. She didn't have anything to bring through the tray slot. She hadn't thought to bring anything. She had just come because it seemed important to be there, which was her mother's advice applied in a context her mother could never have anticipated. He got up from his cot and crossed to the partition and sat down on the floor on his side of it, which put his eye level slightly below hers and meant he had to tilt his head up to look at her. This was a posture she had not seen him use before. She filed it in her notepad in her mind without writing it down. Some things were too new and too uncertain for the false confidence of notation. He reached into his secondary limbs folded joint, a small interior space she hadn't been aware he could access, and withdrew the flat stone. The one he'd had since intake. He looked at it for a moment. Then he pushed it through the tray slot. She looked at it on the table in front of her. She looked at him. He held both primary hands open, palms up, not the formal consent gesture, something less structured, something that was closer to offering than to asking. She picked up the stone. It was warm from his body. It was smooth on all sides, unworked, the kind of smooth that came from a long time of water and movement. It fit in her hand with the weight of something that had existed for much longer than either of them and would continue to exist long after. She held it. She reached into her own pocket. She had a pen, a physical pen, the kind she preferred for her notepad, a small unremarkable thing. She looked at it. She pushed it through the tray slot. He picked it up with the careful attention he brought to anything new. He turned it in his primary hand. He pressed the tip to his secondary palm and drew a line, a single careful stroke, watching the ink appear with something that looked, at its core, exactly like wonder. She had seen that look on the faces of children. She had not expected to see it here. She had not expected a great many things about the past 39 days. They sat like that for a long time. The overnight station hummed around them. The Vera wind moved across the plateau. Neither of them said anything in any language. Neither of them needed to. She held his stone. He held her pen. And the thing that sat between them in the room, the thing she couldn't name and had stopped trying to name, was very large and very quiet and entirely stubbornly real. The repatriation convoy was scheduled for 0800 on day 42. Mara was not on duty. She was not assigned to the departure area. She went anyway, standing at a distance that was technically outside the formal security perimeter and therefore technically not a violation of anything, in the gray pre-dawn of a Vera morning that smelled like clay and coming rain. There were 11 Veth in the convoy, drawn from Vera Station and the 2 smaller processing facilities that fed into it. Most of them Mara had never seen. She recognized Thresh at once, not just by height or coloring but by the particular quality of stillness that she had come to associate with him, a stillness that was not passive but watchful, the stillness of something paying close attention to its surroundings. He found her at about the same moment she found him. She was not sure how. She was standing 60 meters away in a group of 5 or 6 other off-duty personnel who had drifted toward the departure area for reasons of their own. He turned and his amber eyes moved through the small crowd and they stopped. The amber-gold chromatic signal at his jaw ridges was visible from 60 meters. She had learned to read it from much greater distances than that. She raised her hand. Palm forward. The first gesture they had shared in the mud on the first night. He raised his primary hand. Palm forward. A moment that lasted approximately 2 seconds and contained, she suspected, more than either of them could have articulated in any language they shared. Then the convoy personnel were moving and he moved with them, and she watched the transport crawlers roll out through the Vera station gate, and she stood in the clay-smelling morning until the dust settled and there was nothing left to watch. She had his stone in her coat pocket. She put her hand around it. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Dr. Hamad filed the research report 6 weeks later. It was a careful document. Hamad was a careful person, and it framed everything in terms of linguistic and behavioral research rather than in the terms Mara might have used, which were harder to put in a report and easier to understand. It was cited, in the months that followed, by 3 different working groups involved in building the post-conflict communication infrastructure. It became, without anyone explicitly intending this, one of the foundational documents of what eventually became the Joint Linguistics Initiative, the first formal institutional structure designed to support ongoing communication between human and Veth representatives. Mara read about this in a memo from command. She was still at Vera Station. She had re-upped her posting for another 6 months, partly because the work was genuinely necessary and partly because she was not sure, yet, what the rest of her life looked like, and the plateau's bleak demanding beauty had become a thing she wasn't ready to leave. She got a communication on day 94. It came through the Joint Linguistics Initiative's new relay system, still experimental, prone to delays, using the 47 concept vocabulary as a base layer with Hamad's expanded work built on top of it. The message was text rendered by the translation software, which meant it was approximate rather than precise, and she read it with the awareness that the words on her screen were a best-effort representation of something that existed in chromatic and subvocal frequencies she couldn't directly perceive. What the software rendered was, asterisk received. Carrying. Question you also, asterisk. She sat with this for a long time. The translation was imprecise. She knew that. But she also knew what it was trying to say, in the way that you sometimes knew things before you could articulate them, in the way that she'd known things about Thresh from the first moment she'd knelt in the mud and opened her kit because she couldn't walk away from someone who needed it. He was carrying something. He wanted to know if she was too. She was. She had the stone in her coat pocket to prove it. She had 42 days of notes in a notepad that she transferred to her personal encrypted storage because it felt too important for the recycling protocols that govern standard medical documentation. She had a reference guide to chromatic signals that was more detailed than anything Hamad's team had formally published, built from observation and attention and the particular intimacy of paying close attention to a person over time. She typed her reply into the relay system. The translation software rendered her words into the closest available approximation of Veth communicative structure. She didn't know how much would survive the translation. She said it anyway. Asterisk yes. Also carrying. Question, what happens next? Asterisk. She sent it. She put her hand in her pocket. She waited. Outside, the Vera Plateau spread brown and gray and quietly beautiful in the way of things that asked nothing of you but rewarded attention. The wind was light today. The sky had the particular quality that meant rain was coming eventually, maybe today, maybe not, and she had learned in 6 months to read the Vera sky the way you learn to read any face you'd spend enough time with. With attention. With patience. With the willingness to be uncertain and remain present anyway. The reply came back in 4 hours. The software rendered it as, * next, continue, threshold not end, beginning place, *. She read it 3 times. She smiled, a slow and private thing because Thresh had used the formal vocabulary concept for threshold, a term from Hamad's list, a logistical word, the word for the boundary between spaces. But he had also, the translation software noted in parentheses, used a chromatic intensifier she had personally catalogued in her notes as recognition, which meant he had understood the double meaning, the threshold that was also, in her language, a name. His name. The one they'd given him because his real name required chambers humans didn't have. He had signed his message with his own name. Used as a concept. Used as a promise. She put the stone on her desk. She looked at it for a moment. Then she started a new page in her notepad and wrote the date and the time and, underneath, in letters that were neither Veth nor English but some combination that was only hers, beginning place. The first formal meeting of the Joint Species Dialogue Council took place 11 months after the cease protocols were signed, in a purpose-built facility on the neutral orbital platform designated Meridian 4. The facility had been constructed by joint engineering teams, an uncomfortable process that had taken 4 months and produced, as a side effect, the first sustained cooperative working relationship between human and Veth professionals. The engineers had figured out, by necessity and frustration and eventual mutual respect, that they needed each other, which was a lesson that the politicians and military planners who'd commissioned the building had been slower to learn. Mara was not on the delegation. She was not a diplomat or a policy specialist or a command-level officer. She was a medical corporal who had re-upped her posting 3 times and was now technically seconded to the Joint Linguistics Initiative as a field communication consultant, which was Hamad's invention and a title that had no official precedent in either military or civilian personnel structures. She was there because Hamad had argued, with the patient precision of someone who had spent 11 months building an institutional case, that the protocols in place at Meridian 4 were derived in significant part from documented interaction patterns first established at Vera Station, and the person with the most direct experience of those patterns was Corporal Osei. She was also there because Thresh was there. He was not on the Veth delegation either, formally. He was there in the same advisory capacity, seconded to the Veth communicative outreach structure in a role that Hamad's Veth counterpart, a scholar named Vessel who communicated primarily in writing relayed through the translation system, had described in terms that rendered approximately as, the one who knows how to begin. They met in person for the first time since day 42 in a corridor outside the main council chamber, 40 minutes before the first session. She had known he was coming. She had not known, until she turned a corner and he was simply there, what it would feel like to see him in a context that was neither a prison nor a window. He was taller than she remembered, or the corridor made him seem taller, or perhaps she'd been remembering him at the slight forward lean he'd maintained in the observation room and his full posture was different. The amber gold chromatic signal was immediate. She felt the recognition of it in her chest before she'd consciously registered seeing it. She raised her hand. Palm forward. He raised his. Palm forward. And then he did something she hadn't seen before. He stepped forward and placed his secondary hand, briefly, against the back of her raised primary hand, a light and deliberate contact that the briefings she'd read back at Vera Station had never once mentioned, and which she understood, without needing Hamad's vocabulary or her own notes or any translation system, to be something that required trust to offer and was not offered lightly. She stood very still while it was happening. She didn't want to misread it. She also didn't want to miss it. They walked into the council chamber together. Not as a delegation or a symbolic gesture. There was no camera recording it, no official present to make it meaningful in the institutional sense. They walked in together because they were both going in the same direction and had fallen into step. The chamber was circular, which had been deliberate. No head of the table, no position of authority, a design philosophy that had generated significant debate before anyone realized that both human and Veth negotiating cultures were going to find the symbolism legible from their respective frameworks, which was one of those small miraculous coincidences that show up occasionally in difficult history. The session lasted 6 hours. It produced 3 agreed protocols and 7 areas of significant disagreement and one moment, approximately 4 hours in, when a human diplomat said something that the translation system rendered in a way that caused visible distress signals in the Veth representatives, and Mara, watching from her observer's seat, caught Thresh's attention across the room and made a small gesture, a lateral hand motion she developed at Vera Station to indicate wait, this is a translation problem, not a meaning problem, and Thresh relayed something to the Veth delegation in subvocal frequencies she couldn't hear, and the distress signals moderated, and the session continued. It was not the most dramatic moment of the day. It was not something that would appear in the official record or the historical account. It was a small thing. Two people drawing on 39 days of building something from scratch, preventing a miscommunication from becoming a rupture. Small things that were not nothing. This was what peace looked like. She was learning. Not the grand gestures, the signings, the summits, the ceremonies. Those were important, she didn't discount them. But the actual tissue of it, the material that held everything else together, was made of small things. A cup through a tray slot. A stone warm from someone's body. A signal cataloged in a notepad that was too important for recycling protocols. A hand raised in a corridor. After the session, they sat together in the observation lounge on Meridian 4's upper level, which had a view of the star field that was the kind of view that made most human problems feel appropriately scaled. She had her notepad. She saw now, her pen. The one she'd pushed through the tray slot on night 39. He carried it home and carried it back. She held his stone in her coat pocket. He took the pen and opened his secondary palm and drew on it. A line. Not a random line, she recognized it from his first attempt, the careful stroke of someone who has practiced something many times in private. He turned his palm to show her. It was a shape. Not a letter from any alphabet she knew. Something else. Something Veth. She looked at it. She looked at him. She picked up her notepad and found a blank page and wrote, in her own careful hand, the word that sat in the center of all of it, the word she'd written on the last page at Vera Station and hadn't stopped thinking about in 11 months. She held it up. He looked at it. The amber gold was very steady. His secondary hand came up in the gesture she'd catalogued as here, take this, I am giving it willingly. Outside, the stars did what stars do, burning in silence, enormous and ancient and present, in the deep and patient way of things that have been there long before any of the wars and intend to remain long after. She looked at what she'd written. He looked at what he'd drawn. The word and the shape sat side by side on different surfaces, meaning the same thing in different languages, in the observation lounge of a neutral orbital platform in the first year of a piece that was still being built, moment, by people who had learned, some of them the hard way, in the mud, in the rain, in the long silence after the gun stopped, that hope was not a thing that appeared. It was a thing that was made. From attention. From patience. From the willingness to kneel in the cold and open your kit when someone needs it, even when the someone is unexpected and the situation is complicated and you have every reasonable excuse to stay in storage bay 9 and finish your inventory count. From the willingness in the end to stay. She had written, beginning. He had drawn, the same.